Welcome to the final module, Module 5 of Developing Vocabulary, a Whole School Approach. In this module, we're going to share with you some of the impact of the strategic approach that the schools we've worked with in Devon have put in place. We hope that you'll get a sense of a small part of some of the feedback that we've had from the number of schools who are working with us, and we hope that it will help you to really think about what you might be able to achieve in your schools. So, starting straight away with looking at the impact. The majority of what we're going to look at in terms of impact outcome data comes from the group of schools that we worked with in year 2 of the project. So these were outcomes from 2019. So this group of schools were the first group of schools that ran the training for themselves within school. There were 14 schools that we worked with. I mentioned that before. And this was just a summary, really, of some of the key outcome related data. As you will know, when you do any kind of initiative in school, you have some outcome data, which can tell you quite a lot. You can also have some outcome data that doesn't tell you very much at all. And also you have a lot of quantitative data and qualitative data. We're going to look at the qualitative in a minute, but just the numbers to start with. So we were really delighted to see that across this group of schools, there was an average improvement of over 4% in their reading outcomes at Key Stage 2. This was particularly striking in Devon because 2019 was the year where several schools across the country saw a real dip in results. And in Devon, we saw a dip of 1%, and nationally there was a 2% decrease. So these schools not only held their results, but increased quite significantly. So reading was an area that was significantly impacted. I think it's also worth drawing attention to the fact that these schools only had 2 terms of working with us. So they had the resources, they delivered the resources in their school, and they had 2 or 3 half-day visits from an advisor in that period of time, and that was the only support that they received. We also looked at how well at Key Stage 2 participating schools had done in the vocabulary parts of the reading paper. I showed you those earlier when we looked at finding out. So we did find that when you looked at the 2 key strands that were related to vocabulary, strand 1 and strand 6, over half of the children in the project schools attained higher than nationally on those strands. So 50% of those children attained higher on strand 1 and 64% on strand 6. That's higher than children nationally. And that was really significant because for many of those schools, when they'd looked at those strands at the beginning of the project, they'd seen that their children were performing really quite poorly in terms of those compared to national outcomes. We did also look at grammar, punctuation and spelling, and there was some good impact there, interestingly, particularly for the more disadvantaged pupils. So we saw an increase for disadvantaged pupils in grammar, spelling and punctuation. When we looked at Key Stage 1, the data was less conclusive, though. The impact seemed less significant. The schools hadn't decreased. Some of them had seen some quite significant increase, but there was no common pattern across the schools that we could pick up on. Although I think there were a couple of factors in there. One of the factors was that many of the schools had focused their work more significantly at Key Stage 2 than at Key Stage 1. We did find, though, some really good feedback in some of the individual schools, particularly schools that were moderated at year 2. On a couple of occasions, there was feedback from those moderation reports that the quality of the vocabulary that the moderator had seen in the children's writing was really striking. And that was fantastic feedback to get for those schools. So if we move on and think a little bit about qualitative data now. We asked teachers to feed back, and leaders and teachers to feed back about the impact that they'd seen from their pupils. And I've put some of the quotes in here that you're welcome to read, but I'll just pull out some things from that because these are representative of very, very many comments. So the reason I've picked them is that they are representative rather than one-off ones. And the first quote, I think, is probably the most resonant one that we received from many, many schools. This idea that children were really fired up and engaged and had, as it says here, a thirst for using new words. They were getting so excited about finding new words, learning new words, using new words. And for many children, this was a significant shift. At the beginning of the project, many of the children were actually quite unconfident talking about words they didn't know were very reluctant to own up to the fact that they didn't know a word. I like the second one, this idea that across the school, pupils were more reflective and selective about the vocabulary that they used, and really being able to think about which words have the best impact in different situations, for particularly in writing for their readers, and that children were actively asking about vocabulary choices in reading. Interestingly, dictionary use increased, and I think useful dictionary use, not just getting them out and flicking from A to Z to try and find a word, but really well chosen use of dictionaries. The priority that schools could see around vocabulary, I like this next one where it talks about every classroom is now word rich. And for me, the important part of that is every classroom. There's a consistent approach across the school as to the richness there. Some schools really went to town on making their environments word rich. Just to share one example with you, a school in a very, very deprived area of Devon set up an approach whereby they would put key bits of tier 2 vocabulary displayed all the way around the school. The idea being that whenever children were near some of that vocabulary and there was an adult around, they would stop and have a conversation about it. And the head teacher shared with me an incident that happened where one of the children in the school, one of the most disadvantaged, one of the most challenged in terms of their learning, basically pretty much grabbed the head teacher by the hand and made her walk around the whole school with her to talk about all the words that she could find. And that sort of thing just has to make a difference. Children using more ambitious words in their vocabulary, and I think, you know, teachers were able to see this clearly where they've done that sort of diagnostic assessment of writing at the beginning and then again midway or at the end. They were clearly able to identify more ambitious selections being made by children, and a lot of that being able to see a direct result of the impact of the words that teachers had chosen to teach. So being able to see that concrete impact of your teaching coming out in children's writing was really empowering for many of the teachers. I love this last quote, and we're going to hear from Ian in a moment, and he will probably say this or something very similar. This idea that children will not accept that they don't know what a word means. Now, if you reflect on that for a moment, that's incredibly powerful, because if we're trying to deal with word gaps, if we're trying to deal with an aspect of early literacy which has been proven to be quite resistant to change, we've all got to be on board working on that. So it's no good just us as teachers trying to pour words into children. We need children really actively learning, and I think this is one of the things that came out so strongly from the work of the schools that we've been focusing on. This idea that children were now absolutely wedded to the idea that they deserve to know what interesting and difficult words mean, that they were empowered to find out what they mean, work it out, and if they couldn't work it out, they were going to go and ask someone, and then that they really wanted to use those words. Now that's hugely powerful and will give those kids great cultural capital as they move forward. I just pulled together, just before we hear from Ian, a few thoughts about the key themes that were emerging in our feedback from schools. So this is really things that a lot of schools felt that they had worked on and that were key things that they wanted to continue to work on. So I think firstly, and this is absolutely fundamental, lots of schools talked about the importance of the choice of vocabulary, particularly for their direct teaching. So which words are you going to choose and where are you going to get them from? That was a really powerful part of their development, absolutely fundamental to making sure that the vocabulary work was contributing to the outcomes that they wanted it to contribute to. And certainly something worth spending time on. We have a whole staff training session. Module 2 of our CPD programme is about which words and why. And I think many schools found that really useful. Even after quite a significant amount of training and development, schools were still not struggling, but working on, you know, are we picking the right words? Are we picking the right tier 2 words? Are we picking sufficiently high value words? Do we need to be systematizing the words that we select to build a sort of a progressive program? So that's where many of our schools are at the moment. Schools also picked up on significantly on this idea of the modelling of high quality use of language by all adults as having a very significant impact. I think there's an implication there, which is that if you're planning to develop vocabulary, you need to think about how you include all adults. Some schools that we worked with actually paid their TAs to be involved in the CPD programme. Others did things like giving TAs some time to do some personal study. We've written a Future Learn Developing Vocabulary course, which is a personal study course which is free to participate in. And some schools gave time to their TAs to go and take that CPD course and reflect on it together. But you need all adults on board with this, and they all need to be modelling that quality of language. If you think back to Jean Gross in Module 1, the really nice examples that she gave from the research, the importance of modelling for children high quality use of language. Consistency, we talked about consistency in Module 4 when we talked about CPD and planning. I think this, for me, has probably been the most impactful part of the work that we've done, which is that we have seen change at a whole school level. And a lot of that has come through the people leading it having that focus on consistency. So this is a whole school approach. This is not, here's some ideas, go and try it in your class if you like. We are all going to take the same approach. It's going to develop, it's going to be progressive, it's going to be systematic, and therefore that familiarity is going to build over time. Ian doesn't talk about this in the video, but when I saw him recently, he talked about how he's beginning to see now that the level of vocabulary that children are bringing into his class is rising year on year as a result of the work that's going on in Year 1 and Foundation before him, and that each of those classes is incrementally taking a little step up. That's happening because of that consistent approach, and that's a fundamental part of any development of vocabulary, I would suggest. Schools have thought in a very cross-curricular way. Some schools have kept their development focused around English in the first instance and are now moving on to think about how they broaden it. Others took a more wider curriculum view right from the outset. And there are some schools who targeted the use of vocabulary in the foundation curriculum as their area of focus. One of the schools I've been working with this year have basically developed a vocabulary spine which underpins the core concepts of their curriculum plan across history and geography and science, and that's looking really, really exciting. I think that's going to make a significant difference for them. So thinking how you can take it cross-curricular. Text choices, quality texts. Amy talked about the choosing high quality text models that they use for their English teaching as being the source of the words to teach. Other schools have taken words from texts they're reading with the children through guided reading or stories that they're sharing with children. But texts and rich texts are a fundamental source of fantastic vocabulary. So lots of schools it's really made them reflect on the quality of text that they're using and whether they could up that. And finally, I think something that's been fed back to us by many of the schools, although they've worked with us in a relatively short period of time, they are very much looking at this as a long-term development and a long-term project. And I think you can hear that particularly in the examples that Amy talked about, how now over 4 years they've continued to refine and develop their approach. And it was identified in their recent Ofsted report as being a significant strength of the school. So we need to think long-term. This is not going to be one of those things where we say, oh, we're doing vocabulary this year and then next year we'll move on and do something else. Vocabulary needs to be the foundations of your English curriculum and your wider curriculum going forward. So thinking about this as being something that will develop over time. Don't expect to get it right straight away. It's not a quick fix, but when you do start to get it right, it can have some significant and profound impacts for children. Okay, I'm just going to sort of finish up in terms of input with hearing from Ian. It's a very short clip, but Ian captures really well, I think, the sorts of impact that some of the schools have seen. So we'll just hear from Ian and get a sense of the powerfulness of what they were able to do.
The impact of the work we did was fantastic. We started off with a baseline assessment. We'd done an analysis of spoken language and written language to see the prevalence of tier 2 words at the beginning, and then we did it again at the end. We saw huge increases. We did qualitative analysis of contact books, the books that parents and children use to communicate about reading at home. The comments in those at the start were very nice reading, read 3 pages, started at page 26. By the end of the project, the books were just filled with comments, questions about words. It did have an impact in terms of children being able to perform better in the reading assessment particularly. Children were more confident, parents were more confident. I think we knew we'd done a good job when in a whole school assembly, the head teacher started off presenting to the audience and used a word that a couple of children didn't understand. Hands shot up, everybody stopped, and the child turned around and says, "Can you tell me what that means, please?" That was exactly what we wanted to achieve. We wanted to achieve a state where people, children, are comfortable finding out that they don't know things. We wanted them to be uncomfortable not knowing what a word means, but being comfortable in then asking and finding out.
Really powerful that. I love hearing Ian talk about that, the impact that it's had in his classroom. And I think it's those little moments where we see individual children showing how they've grown and how they've changed, which is what we're really looking for. I really hope that you have enjoyed working through this taster CPD with us. I've certainly enjoyed putting it together. We've come to the end of this CPD module that we're running in conjunction with Pearson now. But just before we finish, I wanted to give you some suggestions of how you can get in touch with us if we can help any further. So please, if you're interested in purchasing the resources that schools used, there'll be a link that coming up in a moment that you can follow that will take you directly to our shop, and you can have a look at it there. Or why not visit our website? We have a vocabulary page. We share some of the things that teachers have done with their children on that page, and also you can find out about the resource there if you'd like to. Otherwise, my email address is on the screen. You're more than welcome to drop me an email if you have any questions or queries, either arising from this CPD that you've done with me or anything else that you'd like to ask me about. I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very, very much for participating. I hope that you managed to set up some fantastic work in terms of vocabulary in your schools, and if you do, drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you.